Welcome to Sanctuary. Today's lesson is on the power of words, and we'll be speaking about the language of life and death. Where do we learn the language of life? Well, God, remember we got through in previous lessons talking about the Bible. The language of life comes from God. And His language is found in the Bible. The Bible is where we learn the language of life. And where we can learn if we are speaking the language of evil or the language of death. So when we know the difference, and we see what the language of life is, then we can also know that we've been speaking words that are not life. So many people don't even know they are speaking death. And a very simple example of learning God's language is like learning mathematics. Mathematics is a language, the language of mathematics. So where do you start with maths? Well, you first have to know what numbers are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then you learn addition. 1 plus 1 equals 2. 4 plus 4 equals 8. Then you start to learn subtraction. 5 minus 3 equals 2. Then you learn multiplication. 2 times 2 equals 4. Then you learn division. 4 divided by 2 is 2. So that is the language of maths. Then you start to go into more advanced things. You start learning trigonometry and geometry and long division, and you learn a lot more complicated, complex thing in mathematics. That is the language. But you will never know trigonometry or geometry if you don't understand 1 plus 1. In fact, you won't know 5 times 5 if you don't understand the basics of maths. So that's how it is in learning the language of life. Most people are asking questions like, how can God be so good, but there's all this evil in the earth? They're asking questions like that, and yet they don't understand 1 plus 1. They don't know the basics of God's language. And so because people don't know God's language, and they ask questions like that, like, why is there so much evil on the earth? Then they listen to what everybody else is saying. And most people don't know God's language. Remember, we got through saying earlier that the language of death is everywhere. It's in the world system. So it's my responsibility and your responsibility to learn the language of life so that we can have answers to people when they ask these kinds of questions. Otherwise, most people just go with what everybody else is saying. And most people are saying, well, God can't be a good God because He lets all these evil things happen on the earth. Well, most people, they don't understand the language of God. And we're going to get into that in later lessons. Our next lesson, we're going to talk about following likes in a culture where we post things and then we get likes. And we also like things and we post those things. So we're going to get into that in the next lesson. Thank you for joining me on Sanctuary.